The morning air bit at my face as I adjusted my pack straps, the familiar weight settling against my back. Mount Wheeler's eastern face loomed ahead, its rocky outcroppings catching the first light of dawn. I'd chosen this trail deliberately, difficult enough to demand my full attention, remote enough that I wouldn't have to make small talk with weekend hikers. 3 days alone in the Sangre de Cristo Range was exactly what Dr. Mercer had prescribed, though not in those exact words. "You need to process what happened, Nathan," she'd said during our last session. "Running from it isn't working." I checked my watch. 5:47 a.m. Perfect timing to reach the ridge by noon. My boots crunched against the gravel as I signed the trail register, noting the empty pages. Mid-October wasn't prime hiking season here. Too cold for casual hikers, too early for the winter climbers. Just how I wanted it. The forest embraced me as I pushed forward, the scent of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. My breath clouded in front of me, dissipating into nothing, like smoke. No. I forced the thought away, focusing instead on my footfalls, the rhythm of my hiking poles striking rock, one step after another. That's all life is, right? Just keep moving forward. By mid-morning, I'd cleared the tree line. The valley sprawled below me, a patchwork of autumn colors and the occasional glint of civilization. The chemical plant was visible from here, its collection of white buildings and storage tanks nestled alongside the river, smoke rising from its stacks in thin, controlled columns. I turned away, focusing instead on the path ahead. The first indication that something was wrong came as a distant rumble. I paused, poles planted firmly, and looked back. At first I thought it was thunder, but the sky remained clear and blue. Then I saw it, a plume of dark smoke rising from where the plant stood, different from the usual emissions, thicker, angrier. My hand instinctively went to the inner pocket of my jacket, fingers brushing against the folded photograph I always carried. Sarah's face flashed in my mind, her laugh, her voice telling me I was being paranoid again. The explosion, when it came, was more felt than heard, a pressure wave that seemed to compress the air around me. I watched, transfixed, as secondary explosions followed, each sending new billows of smoke skyward. But it wasn't just smoke anymore. There was something else mixing with it, something that caught the sunlight differently, a pale green mist that seemed to pool and flow across the valley floor like liquid. I knew immediately what I was seeing. The plant manufactured agricultural chemicals, including a new experimental pesticide. I'd read about it in the environmental impact reports. My job as County Environmental Assessment Officer had made sure of that. The reports had assured us all that safety measures were redundant, fail-safes in place. So much for fail-safes. The mist was spreading rapidly, following the contours of the land, flowing like water down the valley. And it was moving in my direction. My training kicked in before conscious thought could form. I turned and began climbing, no longer caring about the trail, taking the most direct route upward. The wind was coming from the west, pushing the cloud eastward, but also up the mountain slopes. I needed elevation, and I needed it fast. My phone showed no service, typical for this area. No way to call for help or warning, no way to know if evacuation orders had been issued. I was on my own. As I climbed, my mind raced through what I knew about the chemical, highly toxic, designed to break down within hours of application in normal concentrations. But this wasn't a normal concentration. This was pure, undiluted chemical soup, and there was no telling how it would behave. One thing was certain. I couldn't let it touch me. I couldn't breathe it in. And right now, my only advantage was elevation and the backpack full of survival gear I'd brought for a peaceful weekend of hiking. The irony wasn't lost on me. After everything, after all my careful planning to avoid another disaster, here I was, running from a cloud of poison, alone on a mountain, just like Sarah had been running, alone in that building. I pushed the thought away and kept climbing. The mist moved with an almost sentient purpose, flowing around obstacles, finding paths of least resistance. From my vantage point 200 feet higher, I watched it creep up the lower slopes, engulfing trees and rocks in its pale green embrace. The beautiful valley I'd admired hours earlier now looked alien, as if some otherworldly fog had descended to claim it. My lungs burned from the rapid ascent, but I couldn't afford to stop. The higher ground of the northern ridge was my goal, a rocky outcropping that jutted from the mountain face, offering a natural shelter and, more importantly, height. The clouds seemed to be staying lower, hugging the contours of the land. I reached the ridge just as the first tendrils of mist licked at the rocks 50 feet below. Collapsing behind a large boulder, I finally allowed myself to catch my breath, gulping air that still seemed clean and pure. From here, I could see for miles in every direction. The cloud had spread throughout the valley, obscuring everything below 9,000 feet. To the east, it continued its inexorable flow, following the river toward the town of Millfield, population 4,200. All those people. Did they know? Had there been time to evacuate? I pulled out my phone again, holding it high, moving it in slow arcs, desperate for even a single bar of reception. Nothing. The satellite messenger in my pack might work, but who would I even contact? What could I say that would make any difference now? The immediate priority was keeping myself alive. I took inventory of my supplies, 3 liters of water, food for 4 days if I rationed carefully, a 1-person tent, sleeping bag rated for 20 degree hours, first aid kit, headlamp, multi-tool, fire starter, map, compass. Standard gear for a weekend trek, not for an indefinite survival situation in a chemical disaster zone. My eyes stung and watered. From exertion, I told myself, not from the chemicals. Not yet. I needed to monitor myself for symptoms, respiratory distress, skin irritation, nausea, dizziness, the early warning signs of chemical exposure. I also needed shelter, something more substantial than my tent, which wouldn't provide any real protection from airborne toxins. The ridge had several rock formations that might offer natural shelter, and I remembered a small cave marked on my topographic map about a mile further up. The wind shifted slightly, and a tendril of mist rose higher than the rest, curling over the edge of my ridge. I scrambled back, heart pounding, watching as it dissipated in the drier air. A warning. This position wasn't high enough. I shouldered my pack and began moving again, staying close to the spine of the ridge, keeping to the western side where the air seemed clearer. The cave, if it existed, and if I could find it, would at least provide a defensible position. Somewhere I could seal myself in, if necessary. As I hiked, my mind kept returning to the plant, to the safety inspections I'd signed off on 6 months ago. Had I missed something? Was there some warning sign I should have caught? The familiar weight of responsibility pressed down on me, heavier than my pack, heavier than the exhaustion in my limbs. "It's not your fault," Sarah would have said. She always knew when I was spiraling into self-blame. But Sarah wasn't here. Sarah was gone, her voice just an echo in my memory. The cave appeared as the sun began its westward descent, little more than a deep crack in the mountainside, but large enough for me to enter. I approached cautiously, aware that I might not be its only occupant. Bears were common in these mountains, and the last thing I needed was to disturb one preparing for winter. The entrance was narrow but opened into a space about 8 feet deep and 6 feet high, enough to sit upright and stretch out to sleep. No signs of animal habitation, though the floor was littered with debris, leaves, twigs, the occasional bird bone. I swept it clean with a broken branch, then unrolled my sleeping pad and bag. From the cave mouth, I could still see the valley, now completely submerged in the pale green cloud. The late afternoon sun cast an eerie glow through the mist, beautiful in a terrifying way. I tried not to think about what was happening below, the wildlife, the plants, the soil itself, all exposed to concentrated toxins. I attempted the satellite messenger, but the cave walls blocked any signal. I'd have to try from outside later, when I was certain the air was safe. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. I heated water on my small camp stove, preparing a meal of rehydrated pasta, forcing myself to eat despite the knot of anxiety in my stomach. I needed the energy. I needed to stay sharp. The night brought new terrors. Without the sun to illuminate it, the cloud below became invisible, making it impossible to track its movements. Every breeze, every shift in the air made me tense, wondering if toxic particles were finding their way to my position. Sleep came in fitful bursts, my dreams filled with billowing green clouds that spoke with Sarah's voice, calling my name, telling me to run. Dawn revealed a transformed world. The cloud had settled during the night, becoming denser, clinging to the lower elevations like a verdant lake. From my position, I could see patches of ground emerging above it, islands in a poisonous sea. The air at my elevation seemed clear, but I knew better than to trust appearances alone. I ventured from the cave cautiously, satellite messenger in hand. This time the device connected, its small light blinking green. I composed a message as concise as possible. Chemical release at Agritech plant. Toxic cloud covering valley. Stranded on Manti Wheeler. Send hazmat. Nathan Wells, County Envies Officer. I hit send, watched the confirmation light blink, then tried my phone again. Still no service. I had no way of knowing if my message had reached anyone who could help, or if help was even possible, given the scale of the disaster. My water supply would last another 2 days at most. After that, I'd need to find a source on the mountain, a spring, a stream, anything that originated above the cloud line and remained uncontaminated. The map showed a small lake about 2 miles further up the ridge, fed by snowmelt. That would be my next destination. But first, I needed to secure my current shelter. I gathered rocks to build a small wall across part of the cave entrance, leaving just enough space to crawl through. Using my emergency survival blanket and duct tape, I created a makeshift door that could be sealed from the inside. It wouldn't stop the chemicals completely if the cloud rose this high, but it might filter the worst of it, give me some extra time. As I worked, I found myself talking aloud, narrating my actions as if explaining them to someone else, to Sarah. The silence was already getting to me, I realized. Just 1 day of isolation, and I was creating imaginary companions. "You always did hate camping," I said to the empty air, smiling despite myself. Sarah had tolerated my outdoor obsessions, but preferred hotels with hot showers and room service. Our compromise had been glamping, fancy tents with real beds and electricity. She'd loved that, the illusion of roughing it without the actual discomfort. By midday, the shelter improvements were as good as they'd get with my limited supplies. I packed what I'd need for a water-finding expedition, leaving the tent and other heavy items cached in the cave. If I couldn't make it back by nightfall, I'd have to improvise shelter near the lake. The path to the lake followed the ridge before cutting across a scree field, loose rock that shifted treacherously underfoot. I moved slowly, testing each step, aware that a twisted ankle or worse could be a death sentence in these circumstances. The exertion and tension had me sweating despite the cool temperature, and I rationed my water sips carefully. As I climbed, I noticed something disturbing. Plants along the path, the hardy alpine grasses and low-growing wildflowers, showed signs of stress. Brown edges on leaves, wilting stems. It could have been the season, the approach of winter, but some instinct told me it was more than that. Particles from the cloud were affecting vegetation even at this height. What was it doing to me then? I paused, taking stock of my body. My eyes still stung, and there was a rawness in my throat I'd attributed to dry mountain air. Now I wasn't so sure. I pulled my buff up over my nose and mouth, a poor substitute for a proper respirator, but better than nothing. The lake, when I finally reached it, was smaller than the map had indicated, more of a large pond, really. Its surface was mirror still, reflecting the blue sky and surrounding peaks. No signs of contamination that I could see, but that meant little. Many chemicals were colorless, odorless. I had a decision to make: risk drinking potentially contaminated water when my supply ran out, or try to descend the mountain on the far side, away from the cloud. The latter option meant abandoning the cave and my emergency beacon position, heading into wilderness with no guarantee of finding help. For now, I collected water from the lake in my empty bottle, adding purification tablets. I'd save it as a last resort. On the return journey, I gathered edible plants I recognized: alpine sorrel with its tangy leaves, the inner bark of pine trees, rich in vitamin C. Supplementing my food supplies might let me stretch them an extra day or two. The sun was low when I returned to the cave, casting long shadows across the mountainside. I sealed myself inside, lit my headlamp, and took out the satellite messenger again. No response to my earlier message. I sent another. Still alive. Cloud stable at 9,000 FT. Need evacuation. Symptoms of exposure beginning. That last part might have been an exaggeration, but I needed them to understand the urgency, if there even was a them receiving my messages. As night fell again, I allowed myself to contemplate the full gravity of my situation. Best case scenario: my messages were received, a rescue operation was being organized, and within days, a helicopter would appear to extract me. Worst case, no one was coming. The disaster was too widespread, resources too stretched, or communications too damaged for my small voice to be heard. In that case, I was truly on my own, trapped above a sea of poison with limited supplies, winter approaching, and no clear path to safety. I pulled out the photograph from my jacket. Sarah on our wedding day, laughing at something I'd said, her eyes bright with joy and promise. 5 years ago, a lifetime. "What would you do, Sare?" I whispered to her image. "What's the play here?" The photograph offered no answers, but asking the question calmed me somehow. Sarah had always been the practical one, the problem solver. She wouldn't waste energy on fear or regret. She'd make a plan and execute it. So that's what I would do. Tomorrow I'd scout the western slopes, look for a possible descent route that avoided the worst of the contamination. I'd monitor the cloud's behavior, try to predict its movements. I'd survive. Because that's what I hadn't done last time. When the university building caught fire, when Sarah was trapped inside, I'd frozen, paralyzed by indecision, by fear. By the time I'd gathered myself enough to act, it was too late. I wouldn't make the same mistake again. I woke to the sound of my own coughing, harsh and painful, in the confined space of the cave. My throat felt as though I'd swallowed ground glass, and my eyes watered continuously. Worse, there was a tightness in my chest that hadn't been there before, a subtle resistance with each breath. Early symptoms of chemical exposure, just as I'd feared. Despite my precautions, despite my elevation, microscopic particles were finding their way to me. The poison was patient, insidious. Outside, the cloud had changed again. Rather than a distinct layer, it had diffused, becoming less visible, but more widespread. In some ways, this was more terrifying. I could no longer clearly see where the danger lay. It could be everywhere, invisible in the morning light. I checked the satellite messenger. Still no response. Either my messages weren't getting through, or whoever received them had more pressing concerns than one stranded hiker. I sent another anyway, detailing my symptoms and location, then turned to more immediate concerns. My first aid kit contained basic medications: ibuprofen for pain and inflammation, antihistamines for allergic reactions, antacids for digestive issues. Nothing specifically designed for chemical exposure. Still, the antihistamines might help with my eyes and throat, so I took one, washing it down with a carefully measured sip of water. The western slope reconnaissance would have to wait. In my current condition, I needed to conserve energy and avoid exertion that would make me breathe more deeply. Instead, I focused on improving my shelter further, using pine boughs to create a crude filter across the entrance, hoping it might trap some of the airborne particles. By midday, the antihistamine had helped somewhat, but the tightness in my chest remained. I forced myself to eat a small meal, a protein bar, and some of the sorrel I'd gathered, though my appetite had vanished. My body needed fuel to fight whatever was happening to it. As I ate, I found myself thinking about the inspection at the plant. The tour had been thorough, the safety protocols seemingly robust, but there had been that moment, that exchange between the plant manager and the chief engineer, a look that passed between them when I'd asked about the emergency containment systems. At the time, I'd dismissed it as nothing. Now I wondered. Had they known? Had they cut corners, falsified reports? Or was this simply an unforeseeable accident, the kind of black swan event that no amount of preparation could prevent? It didn't matter now. Assigning blame wouldn't change my situation. But the thought nagged at me, another weight to carry. The afternoon brought a new development, a helicopter in the distance, flying low over the valley. I scrambled outside, waving frantically, shouting, though I knew they couldn't hear me. The aircraft moved in a grid pattern, clearly searching or surveying, but it remained far from my position, focused on the areas directly around the plant. Still, it was the first sign that some sort of response was underway. Someone knew about the disaster. Someone was doing something. The knowledge should have been comforting, but it only underscored how far I was from that help, how isolated on my mountain perch. As the helicopter disappeared from view, a wave of dizziness washed over me. I staggered, catching myself against the rock wall, and slid down to sit with my head between my knees. The world spun, colors bleeding together like a watercolor left in the rain. Nausea rose in my throat. More symptoms, worse symptoms. I crawled back into the cave, sealed the entrance as best I could, and curled on my sleeping bag, shivering despite the lack of cold. My body was fighting something it didn't understand, something it had no natural defenses against. Time became fluid, measured in waves of nausea and moments of clarity. I drifted in and out of consciousness, dreams and reality blurring. Sarah was there sometimes, sitting beside me, pressing a cool hand to my forehead. Other times I was alone, the cave walls pressing in, the air thick and insufficient. Night fell, or perhaps it had been night for hours already. I couldn't tell any more. My headlamp beam seemed dim, failing. No, my vision was failing. Shadows crept at the edges, narrowing my world to a small circle of light. I fumbled for the satellite messenger, needing to send one more message to let someone know what was happening. My fingers felt swollen, clumsy, refusing to obey simple commands. I managed to type, "Severe symptoms, need medical evacuation, please." I hit send, then collapsed back, exhaustion overwhelming me. My last conscious thought was that I should drink water, that dehydration would only make everything worse. But the bottle seemed miles away, unreachable across the vast distance of my sleeping bag. Darkness took me. I was walking through the university building, smoke filling the corridors, alarms blaring. I knew Sarah was somewhere inside, knew I needed to find her, but every door I opened led to another identical hallway. My feet moved as if through molasses, each step requiring immense effort. "Nathan!" Her voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. I tried to call back, but no sound emerged, my lungs filled with smoke, with green mist, with failure. The scene shifted. I was in our apartment, Sarah across from me at the breakfast table, reading the environmental impact report for the chemical plant. "It doesn't add up," she said, but her mouth didn't move. The words simply appeared in my mind. The containment protocols, they're insufficient. I tried to take the report from her, but my hands passed through the paper, through her arms, as if I were the ghost, not her. "You need to get up, Nathan," she said, her eyes suddenly meeting mine, intense and urgent. "Get up now." I woke with a gasp that turned into a coughing fit, each spasm sending knives of pain through my chest. The cave was dark, my headlamp had died or switched off. For a moment, disorientation gripped me. Where was I? What had happened? Then it all rushed back. The explosion, the cloud, my desperate climb, the symptoms. How long had I been unconscious? Hours? A day? My watch said 3:17, but whether that was AM or PM, I couldn't tell from inside the cave. I felt for my water bottle and drank deeply, no longer concerned with rationing. Dehydration was a more immediate threat than running out. My fever had broken, leaving me drenched in sweat and shivering in the cool air. The nausea had subsided somewhat, though my head still pounded and my vision swam when I moved too quickly. I was alive, though. That was something. I crawled to the cave entrance and carefully pushed aside my makeshift door. Daylight flooded in, afternoon light, golden and slanting. I'd lost about a day to the fever. The world outside had changed again. The diffuse cloud had thinned further, becoming almost invisible except where sunlight caught it at certain angles. A deceptive clearness, as if the danger had passed. But the vegetation told a different story. More plants had withered, and I spotted a dead bird on a nearby rock, its feathers dull, its small body rigid. The chemicals were still present, still deadly, just harder to see. And I had been marinating in them for days now. I checked the satellite messenger, hope flaring briefly, when I saw its light blinking. A response, finally. The message was terse. Search and rescue operations underway, multiple casualties, stay at elevation, avoid contact with vegetation, water sources, conserve energy, S-tier extraction, 72 hours. 72 hours. 3 more days on the mountain, assuming they could even reach me then. Could I last that long? My food supplies were dwindling, my water nearly gone, and my body was weakened by whatever toxins I'd already absorbed. I had no choice but to try. First priority, water. The lake I'd found earlier was my only option, contaminated or not. I gathered my strength and supplies for another expedition, moving slowly, stopping frequently to rest. The dizziness came in waves, forcing me to sit with my head down until it passed. The journey that had taken 2 hours before now consumed most of the day. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across its surface. Up close, I could see that something was wrong, a film on the water, a subtle iridescence like an oil slick. Dead insects dotted the shore, their bodies forming a grisly tide line. I hesitated, bottle in hand. Drinking this water might kill me faster than dehydration, but without it, I had no chance at all. In the end, I compromised. I collected water, added double the recommended purification tablets, and resolved to drink it only when absolutely necessary. I also gathered what edible plants remained, avoiding any showing signs of contamination. The return journey was even slower, darkness falling before I was halfway back. My headlamp, which I'd recharged somewhat using the small solar panel on my pack, provided just enough light to avoid stumbling off the path. Every few minutes I had to stop, my lungs refusing to provide enough oxygen for continuous movement. I reached the cave near midnight, exhausted beyond measure. After sealing the entrance, I allowed myself a small sip of the treated lake water. It tasted metallic, wrong, but my body craved the hydration too much to care. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by coughing and fever dreams. Sarah was always there, sometimes as she had been in life, laughing, arguing, loving, and sometimes as a guide, showing me paths down the mountain, pointing out dangers I couldn't see. "You're not really here," I told her, during one particularly vivid episode. "Does it matter?" Dream Sarah asked, sitting cross-legged at the foot of my sleeping bag. "I'm helping you stay alive." "I couldn't save you," I said, the admission tearing from me like a physical wound. I froze. I couldn't decide what to do, which way to go, and you died because of it. "And now you think the universe is giving you a second chance?" She smiled sadly. "It doesn't work that way, Nate. This isn't about redemption. It's just survival." "Then why are you here?" "Because you need me to be." She reached out, her hand stopping just short of touching my face. "Because you haven't let me go." I woke with tears on my face and the taste of metal in my mouth. Outside, dawn was breaking, revealing another day in my poisoned prison. 72 hours, the message had said. 1 day down, 2 to go. If I could hold on that long. The second day of waiting brought new challenges. My cough had worsened, becoming productive, bringing up phlegm streaked with blood. The skin on my hands and face had developed a rash, small red bumps that itched incessantly. And most concerning, my urine had darkened to an alarming amber color, suggesting my kidneys were struggling to filter the toxins from my system. I sent regular updates via the satellite messenger, detailing my symptoms and condition. The responses when they came were brief and increasingly concerning. Rescue delayed. Heavy contamination preventing helicopter approach. Alternative extraction methods being evaluated. And later, maintain position. Medical team advises activated charcoal if available. Wrap face with damp cloth when outside. I had no activated charcoal, but I followed the advice about the damp cloth, using one of my spare shirts soaked in the questionable lake water. It helped with the breathing somewhat, though the constant moisture irritated my rash further. By midday, I'd made a decision. I couldn't simply wait for a rescue that might never come. My condition was deteriorating, and staying in place meant certain death by toxicity or starvation. I needed to attempt a descent on the western slope, away from the plant, toward areas that might have escaped the worst of the contamination. I packed carefully, taking only what was essential: water, remaining food, first aid kit, navigation tools, emergency blanket, headlamp. Everything else, tent, cooking gear, extra clothes, I left in the cave. Weight would only slow me down, and speed might be the difference between survival and death. Before leaving, I sent one final message. Attempting descent via western slope. Will follow Williams Creek drainage to Forest Service Road 42. Symptoms worsening. If you're coming, look for me along that route. The western slope was steeper than the eastern approach I'd used to ascend, characterized by loose scree fields interspersed with stands of stunted pine. I moved carefully, using my trekking poles for stability, stopping frequently to catch my breath and assess my surroundings. The air seemed clearer here, the prevailing winds having pushed much of the chemical cloud eastward. Still, I kept the damp cloth over my face, unwilling to take chances. The descent was arduous, each step jarring my weakened body, each breath a negotiation with failing lungs. By late afternoon, I'd dropped nearly 2,000 feet in elevation. The vegetation here showed less damage, suggesting lower contamination levels. I allowed myself a moment of hope. If I could reach the Forest Service road by tomorrow, I might encounter rescue teams, or at least be able to follow the road to eventual help. I made camp in a small clearing, using the emergency blanket as a rudimentary shelter strung between two pines. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, and I huddled beneath the blanket, shivering despite my layers. Without my sleeping bag, the night would be uncomfortable at best, dangerous at worst. To distract myself from the cold, I took out Sarah's photograph again. The edges were worn now from constant handling, the image slightly faded. I traced her face with a finger, remembering the day it was taken, how the photographer had captured her mid-laugh after I'd whispered something ridiculous in her ear during what was supposed to be a serious portrait. "I'm trying," I told her image. "I'm not freezing this time." Sleep came eventually, a shallow, troubled state punctuated by shivers and coughing fits. I dreamed of Sarah again, but differently this time. She wasn't speaking to me or guiding me. She was simply walking ahead on a path, occasionally looking back to make sure I was following, her expression neither sad nor happy, just determined. I woke before dawn, stiff and aching, but alive. The rash had spread overnight, now covering most of my exposed skin. My cough brought up more blood-streaked mucus, and standing made the world tilt, alarmingly. But the Forest Service road was perhaps 5 miles away, a difficult journey in my condition, but not impossible. I packed my meager camp and continued downward, following the drainage of Williams Creek as planned. The creek itself appeared around mid-morning, a small, clear stream cutting through the forest. I approached it cautiously, looking for signs of contamination, dead fish, unusual coloration, the oily film I'd seen on the lake. Finding none, I refilled my water bottles, added purification tablets, and drank deeply for the first time in days. The water revived me somewhat, giving me energy to push forward. The going was easier now, the creek providing a natural path through the forest. By noon, I estimated I'd covered half the distance to the road. My pace was slow but steady, each step a small victory against the weakness in my limbs. Then I heard it. A sound so unexpected it stopped me in my tracks. A human voice calling from somewhere ahead. "Hello? Is someone there?" I tried to call back, but my ravaged throat produced only a hoarse croak. I moved forward faster, stumbling in my haste, following the sound of the voice. Rounding a bend in the creek, I saw him, a figure in a bright yellow hazmat suit, complete with respirator and air tank. I waved frantically, using my trekking poles to keep myself upright. The figure saw me, raised a hand in acknowledgement, then spoke into a radio at his shoulder. Within minutes, 2 more suited figures appeared, moving quickly in my direction. As they reached me, my legs finally gave out. I collapsed to my knees, overcome with relief and exhaustion. One of the rescuers knelt beside me, their face obscured behind the mask, but their voice clear through some kind of speaker. "Nathan Wells? We've been looking for you. Medical team is on standby at the perimeter. Can you walk with assistance?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. 2 of them helped me up, supporting my weight between them. The third collected my pack, examining it briefly before slinging it over their shoulder. "The chemical release," I managed to rasp. "How bad?" A pause, the rescuers exchanging glances through their faceplates. "We'll brief you at the medical station," one said finally. "Right now, we need to focus on getting you out of the contamination zone." They guided me along the creek, moving faster than I could have managed alone. After about a mile, we reached a clearing where a rugged ATV waited, equipped with a covered rear compartment. "This will get us to the decontamination point faster," the lead rescuer explained. "You'll need to be thoroughly cleaned before medical treatment." I nodded again, allowing them to help me into the compartment. As the ATV started moving, jolting over the rough terrain, I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. The world narrowed to a pinpoint of light, then expanded again, pulsing with my heartbeat. "Stay with us, Nathan," one of the rescuers said, noting my distress. "We're almost there." I tried to focus on their voice, on the movement of the vehicle, on anything that would keep me conscious. But the darkness at the edges of my vision grew, encroaching steadily until it swallowed everything. The last thing I heard was the urgent voice of the rescuer calling for medical support, and then nothing. I awoke to the hiss of oxygen and the steady beep of monitoring equipment. A clear plastic tent enclosed the hospital bed, creating a sealed environment around me. Beyond it, figures moved in hazmat suits, checking readings, adjusting equipment. My throat felt raw but improved, as if someone had scrubbed it clean from the inside. My lungs expanded more easily, the tightness significantly reduced. An IV line ran into my arm, delivering clear fluid. Another line, darker, ran from a dialysis machine beside the bed. One of the suited figures noticed I was awake and approached, pressing a button that activated a speaker system. "Mr. Wells, I'm Dr. Patel. You're in the containment ward at Memorial Hospital. You've been unconscious for approximately 18 hours while we've been treating you for chemical exposure." "The cloud," I managed, my voice barely audible. "How many?" Dr. Patel hesitated, then seemed to decide I deserved the truth. 17 confirmed fatalities so far, mostly plant workers caught in the initial explosion. Another 43 hospitalized with varying degrees of exposure. The evacuation was largely successful. We had about 2 hours warning before the cloud reached populated areas. I closed my eyes, absorbing the information. 17 dead. It could have been thousands if the wind had been different, if the evacuation had failed. The chemicals? I asked. A mixture of organophosphates and experimental compounds. Your body has accumulated significant levels, but we're removing them through dialysis and specialized chelation therapy. Your kidneys and liver show signs of stress, but should recover with time. How long? Until you're released? At least a week, possibly longer. The long-term effects of this exposure are unknown. You'll need regular monitoring for months, possibly years. I nodded, too exhausted to ask more questions. Dr. Patel seemed to understand. Rest now. We'll talk more when you're stronger. The next few days passed in a blur of treatments, tests, and brief periods of consciousness. Gradually, the plastic tent was removed, though visitors still wore protective gear when entering my room. The dialysis continued, filtering toxins from my blood. My rash faded, my cough improved, and the blood in my sputum disappeared. On the fourth day, I was strong enough to watch the news. The chemical disaster dominated every channel with footage of the cloud, evacuation efforts, and the ongoing cleanup. The plant was a total loss, a blackened ruin surrounded by dead vegetation. The EPA had established a 5-mile exclusion zone around it, with warnings that certain areas might remain uninhabitable for months. An investigation was underway, focusing on the cause of the explosion and the adequacy of the plant's safety systems. Several former employees had come forward with allegations of ignored warnings and falsified safety reports. I watched it all with a strange detachment, as if it were happening to someone else, in some other place. The mountain, the cave, the desperate descent, it all seemed like a dream now, fading around the edges. On the sixth day, a visitor arrived who wasn't medical staff. A woman in her 50s, wearing the required protective suit but with the faceplate raised, revealing sharp features and keen eyes. She introduced herself as Agent Diane Foster from the Environmental Crimes Division of the FBI. "Mr. Wells," she said, taking a seat beside my bed, "I understand you were the County Environmental Assessment Officer who signed off on the plant safety protocols last year." Not a question, but an accusation. I nodded slowly. "Everything seemed in order," I said, my voice stronger now, but still rough. "All the documentation, all the inspections, there were no red flags." "We've found evidence suggesting key safety data was falsified," Foster said. "Specifically, information about the emergency containment systems that failed during the explosion. As the signing officer, your testimony will be crucial to our case." "I'll tell you everything I remember," I said. "But I want to be clear. If I missed something, if I should have caught these falsifications, I accept full responsibility." Foster's expression softened slightly. "From what we've gathered so far, the deception was sophisticated and deliberate. Multiple layers of verification were compromised. You may have been set up to miss it." The words should have been comforting, but they weren't. 17 people were dead. Regardless of intention, I had failed in my duty to protect them. "There's something else," I said, remembering. "During the inspection tour, there was a moment between the plant manager and the chief engineer, a look that passed between them when I asked about the emergency systems. At the time I dismissed it, but now—" Foster leaned forward, suddenly intent. "Can you describe this interaction in detail? Who exactly was present? What was said?" I closed my eyes, summoning the memory. "We were in the control room. I'd asked about the redundancies in the containment system, specifically whether they could handle a cascading failure scenario. The manager, Harrison, I think his name was, he started to answer, but then looked at the engineer. Chen, Dr. Chen. There was this moment of hesitation. Then Chen jumped in, showing me simulations, documentation. Very convincing stuff." "And you felt something was off about this exchange?" "Not enough to flag it officially. Just a feeling. Instinct, maybe. But I ignored it because everything on paper looked perfect." Foster made notes on a tablet, her expression unreadable. "Your instinct was good, Mr. Wells. We've taken both Harrison and Chen into custody. Chen has already started talking, claiming Harrison pressured him to falsify safety models to avoid costly upgrades." The information settled like a weight on my chest, heavier than the chemical damage to my lungs. I had sensed something wrong and done nothing, just like with the fire, with Sarah, paralyzed by indecision, by the fear of making the wrong call. "I should have pushed harder," I said quietly. Foster studied me for a long moment. "Perhaps, but dwelling on what you should have done won't help now. What matters is what you do next. Your testimony could ensure this doesn't happen again." After she left, I lay awake for hours, thinking about choices and consequences, about the moments that define us, not the big, dramatic decisions, but the small ones, the slight hesitations, the doubts pushed aside, the instincts ignored. Sarah had died because I couldn't decide which stairwell to take, which floor to search first. 17 others had died because I couldn't bring myself to question a suspicious glance, to dig deeper when something felt wrong. But I had survived the mountain. I had made choices there, to climb higher, to seek shelter, to attempt the descent, rather than waiting passively for rescue. Imperfect choices, perhaps, but active ones. Maybe that was the lesson Sarah had been trying to teach me in those fever dreams. Not redemption, but action. Not perfect decisions, but decisions nonetheless. 3 months after the disaster, I stood at the edge of the exclusion zone, now marked by chain-link fence and warning signs. Winter had come to the valley, covering much of the contamination with a blanket of snow that made the devastation less visible, but no less real. My physical recovery had progressed well. My lungs would never be quite the same. The doctors had been clear about that. But I could breathe without pain, walk without exhaustion. The regular blood tests showed decreasing levels of toxins, though some compounds would likely remain in my system for years. The psychological recovery was proving more complex. Nightmares still came frequently, visions of green mist, of Sarah calling from within it, of choices unmade and paths not taken. During waking hours, I found myself analyzing every decision, no matter how small, turning options over and over until they lost all meaning. Dr. Mercer called it decision paralysis, a trauma response to the 2 major events where my choices, or lack thereof, had resulted in death. We were working on it, session by session, developing techniques to break the cycle of overthinking. Today was part of that therapy. Coming back to the site, confronting it directly, rather than allowing it to remain a nebulous horror in my mind. "Nathan." I turned to find Agent Foster approaching, bundled against the cold in a heavy coat, her breath clouding in the winter air. We'd been in regular contact during the investigation, my testimony forming a key part of the case against Harrison, Chen, and several executives from the parent company. "The grand jury returned indictments this morning," she said without preamble. "Criminal negligence resulting in death, environmental crimes, fraud, conspiracy. They'll be arraigned next week." I nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Satisfaction that justice was being pursued, but no real sense of closure. The dead remained dead. The valley remained poisoned. "Your testimony was crucial," Foster continued, "particularly the details about that exchange you witnessed. It corroborated everything Chen told us." "Will it make a difference?" I asked, gesturing toward the exclusion zone. "This will happen again somewhere else. Different chemicals, different company, same story." "Maybe," Foster acknowledged, "but maybe not. The fines in this case will be unprecedented, the criminal penalties significant. It sends a message." We stood in silence for a moment, watching as a team of researchers in protective gear collected samples from just inside the fence line. The snow where they worked had been cleared, revealing bare earth beneath, earth that would likely remain toxic for decades. "I've been offered a position," I said finally. "With the EPA's emergency response team, they want someone with first-hand experience of chemical disasters." Foster raised an eyebrow. Are you going to take it? I'm considering it. I paused, organizing my thoughts. For a long time, I've been afraid of making the wrong decision. After Sarah died, after the plant, I became paralyzed by the fear that whatever choice I made would lead to more tragedy. And now? Now I understand that not choosing is itself a choice, usually the worst one. On the mountain, I had to make decisions. Imperfect, incomplete, but active. And I survived. Foster nodded slowly. So, the EPA job would put me in situations where decisions have to be made quickly, with limited information, where I can't afford to freeze. I turned to look at Mount Wheeler, its peak gleaming white against the blue sky. It terrifies me, but I think it's what I need to do. Later that day, I drove to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. I hadn't visited since before the disaster, too caught in my own spiral of grief and guilt. The grounds were quiet, most visitors deterred by the cold and the thin layer of snow covering the paths. I found her headstone easily, brushed the snow from its surface, and placed the small bunch of winter flowers I'd brought against it. I made it down the mountain, I told her, my voice the only sound in the stillness. Not gracefully, not perfectly, but I made it. And I've been thinking about what you would say if you were here. The wind whispered through the bare branches of a nearby tree, the only response. You'd tell me to stop waiting for perfect clarity before acting. You'd tell me that life is a series of best guesses, of choices made with insufficient information. I smiled slightly, remembering. You always said I overthink everything. I knelt, not minding the snow soaking through my jeans, and traced the letters of her name on the stone. I'm taking the EPA job. I'll probably make mistakes. People might get hurt because of decisions I make or don't make. But I can't let that possibility paralyze me anymore. Standing, I took one last look at the headstone, at the dates that encompassed a life too short but fully lived. Sarah had never been afraid to choose, to act, to move forward, even when the path wasn't clear. I'm letting you go, I said softly. Not forgetting you, never that, but letting go of the guilt, of the what-ifs. You wouldn't want them for me. As I walked back to my car, snow began to fall again, light flakes that danced in the air before settling. In a few months, spring would come, bringing new growth, even to the exclusion zone. Different plants, perhaps, adapted to the changed soil, different animals finding new niches in the altered ecosystem. Life continuing, as it always does, finding paths forward